Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm really excited when I heard about this conference, talking about ways we can synergize, improve interoperability. With ontologies, we really want to maximize their usage, their reuse. They're a lot of work. Everyone on this call puts in tons of hours and years putting them together. And so we really want to improve how we can synergize them. And I'm really glad to hear about the topic, and I'll explore that today in my talk. I'm going to start. Hopefully this will proceed. Let's see. There we go. Okay, I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background on the Human Disease Ontology. This is a project that I've been involved with about 20 years now. This is a group where we put together the classification of human disease, every type of human disease imaginable. And we also bring in things like shared vocabularies from clinical vocabularies from the UMLS, or we hand curate them like all the rare disease ones and OMIM. We bring them into, we have this cross connection, this interoperability, hopefully across clinical vocabularies. That's the idea. We want to, again, synergize the domain of disease so we understand, have hopefully a common understanding of what the terminologies are. There's always ongoing changes in nomenclature. There's also evolving knowledge. So the box in the middle of the screen showing you the different ontologies that we import so that we can have better and more refined classifications of human disease. Again, this is just trying to really have a deeper understanding of what's going on, because as you know, diseases can be fairly complicated. I'm only briefly going over that, and then I'm going to talk about more ways we do synergize, or things you can think about and think about synergy. When resources like I'm showing here in this diagram utilize common vocabularies, both terms and IDs, they are synergizing that knowledge, right? It gives another way to walk between the systems and hopefully have, content that we can share and understand and compare. So that's the point of this slide. And then thinking about how ontologies in general. So this is an example of the disease ontology, but I think many ontologies in the OBO Foundry and others utilize these types of methods. So on the left, talking about community, we synergize through term requests. People are reading a lot of papers, thinking about data. They coordinate the terms they want to use across various biomedical domains by asking about term requests. These term requests are great conversations and opportunities to have these discussions when there are disagreements, which is always, I think, very fruitful. We also import ontologies, as I was mentioning on the previous slide, from within our own ontologies to be able to have a further refinement. And then I have a bit of a drop down there to show you some different ones. These terms are part of what we call axioms. So we define relationships between diseases using things like chemical entities or cell types to give us better understanding and deeper knowledge about those mechanisms. And as was mentioned earlier, efforts to standardize the mappings and really reassess mappings we're bringing in is a great opportunity for us to really think about how they're changing over time. They're not a static entity, right? Each of these resources is evolving on its own, and it's great and I hope we can, even with these mapping efforts, go further to say when are mappings altering, instead of us finding them out when we're reassessing a set of data or doing a UMLS update. When do we actually have new knowledge changing? So that would be fantastic if we can do that as an outcome of this meeting. I'm going to give you a couple examples of when we synergize between ontological domains. This is just one slide here. But with phenotypes and diseases and this area of knowledge, it is quite messy, as I'm sure everyone's aware. There's overlap in nomenclature over time. There's different ways of thinking about the data. And they're all quite accurate and fine for their areas, whether it's phenotypes or diseases or syndromes, things like that. But what we have to think about is when we're utilizing this data, which area of those are we working in? And recognizing that something like cleft lip or cleft palate can on its own be a congenital condition. It can also be a trait or a feature of a syndrome, or individually be its own phenotype. So I think it's important to point that out, to think about that. We have to have those distinctions in mind when we're using the data. Not just use the words, but actually think about what the knowledge is behind them. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about synergizing within ontological domains. And I'm putting my OBO Foundry hat on here. just to mention it a little bit. So as the OBO Foundry developed the last 20 years, one of the guiding principles for development was a scope principle. And this is really an ideal, right? So that we would have for any particular domain, say cells or phenotypes, or in my case, disease, and many others, that we would come together and form ontologies that would represent that domain, right? And as we grow and evolve and develop, we'd have a resource then to pick terms, to work together on common consensus of ideas to move forward. So again, I want you to keep in mind the word ideal in this situation. Looking just this past week, just as to give you a reference, I did it in the Ontology Lookup Service, looking at the variety of proliferation of ontologies in these various domains. As you can see here by the numbers, there's a lot of ontologies. And I think that's great. It means we're doing the right things, that people are standardizing their data. But again, I think it also brings a challenge that we have drift. We have possibilities of losing synergy between resources. Because I mean, it's not always part of the initial effort always to synergize and to have that ideal of working together. But then there's also, people have their own use cases. They have their own grants to write, their own papers to write. So that this again is a challenge that we're facing, I think, when we're talking today. I'll give you a couple examples from the disease ontology. So as you look at this screen, yes, and I realize there's a lot here. I was really curious that over time, what are the different ontologies out there that have published using the disease ontology, have them in their resources, but there's so many different ways, right? You may use a term from an ontology, an ID, all sorts of ways. I list them at the top of the screen. And so I have a smattering of blue ontologies highlighted here, different, specific diseases, right, that I would expect to be developed. But then a couple of the green ones at the bottom of the screen. Quite surprised, public health document ontology, vaccine informed consent ontology. And I think it's great that we're expanding in many directions, but again, it's a challenge, right? How do we continue to connect the data across uses that are well beyond what we initially intended? I mean, it's great they're using them, but how do we keep that synergy going? Hopefully I'm challenging people's thinking on this when I'm bringing up these subjects. So one more. So the disease ontology, we've been around for a while, but we spent about a year with the collaborative with the OBO community, rethinking our ontology definition just for the word disease back around 2006. And quite naturally, as different resources develop and grow, new IDs get put in place. The term may change a little bit, the definition may change a little bit, and that's quite natural, and it's great, it's no problem. And we have cross references, but at the same time, how do we connect them? Like, how do we let someone else know that these are really the same concept? And I really love Martin's globally unique identifier idea. I'm quite taken with that. But there's got to be a way that we can help the community know we're all talking about the same thing. So some synergy challenges, just to go over a few, and I've mentioned some of them, and then some have been mentioned in other talks, but two, the blue ones here, I want to highlight. Asynchronous update cycles. So that's a reality of doing all this work, right? So the UMLS updates twice a year. Each of us, our ontologies, have our own cycles, be it monthly, weekly, and the various clinical vocabularies are linked to have their own cycle. So just that change of update cycle can put us out of whack with each other and affect these mappings. And the other thing I wanted to mention is lumping and splitting. This does happen as knowledge changes, but as communities kind of come to consensus of when do we define, say, working on genetic diseases or molecular subtypes of cancers, as a community, when do we decide that there's a new disease? When is there enough evidence? When is there enough evidence about phenotypic variation in a disease to really call it a new disease? Or is it just, a different presentation of that disease? I give you one example here. I was asked this last week about this mesh ID, because in DOE we have two terms. Mesh, we didn't have two mesh IDs. They had the same mesh ID. But then when you look at mesh, this is a part of the lumping and splitting, right? They had yet not to decide that they would be two terms, but whereas we had, and we all have our own reasons. But again, this creates, I think, complexity in the mappings that are a reality. But then again, how do we deal with it? And how do we best represent it? So 2 slides on best practices, thinking about what do we do so I come from the perspective of a reference ontology. We engage in the community, we hope to define a domain, we work with groups as they develop their own ontologies for term requests. But then on the other end, when we're developing resources ourselves, other resources, how do we then be part of this synergy effort and then make sure those ontologies get updated, the terms get shared. So it's something just, I think, want people to think about, how can we all have best practices for synergy as we are developing our resources. And then I just have one last slide. And this one is more about ideas of enhancing synergy. So there's 3 I want to go over. One, all these resources that say, yes, I want you to reuse my identifiers. Is there a simple way we could just tag our resources in the bio portal, OBO Foundry, Ontology Lookup Service, like a simple symbol on our page says, yep, please reuse me. I intend that you're going to reuse my identifiers. That's one of the reasons this ontology was created. So 2, provenance, talking about where did these terms come from. So when you have an ontology and people reuse your terms, that's fabulous, but there's not really a way beyond the current xrefs that we do use to show where it came from. So an xref is really, it's a mapping, right? A one-to-one mapping, hopefully, but it's not, say, indicating the provenance of where that term came from. So maybe that would help us have synergy. And then the last one's more of a challenge out to everyone on the call. Is there a simpler way we could devise when ontologies, say within a particular domain, are creating new terms, instead of having to go and contact the reference ontology, can they just flag it somehow? Could it be put into the other group's GitHub repository? Is there an automated way we could share this growth of terms without adding more burden to people who are already doing a lot of work developing the ontologies? So that's what I'm going to leave you with, and hopefully it's some food for thought on things that we can discuss.
Lynn, thank you. Great. Fantastic overview. This is great, you know. So I was just actually thinking while you were giving the talk, you know, like that. And please again, everybody ask questions via the chat, please. Yeah, I see this discussion going on, but you know, you can direct the questions, of course, directly to the speaker. But I was wondering, right? Sounds like, I mean, the OBO, of course, is a super established community, right? And has this ideal of having unique non-overlapping reference ontologies. But I'm thinking like the tools that we built, and we can discuss it a little bit later. It seems like, you know, from your talk and from other talks earlier that, you know, the ontology request, you know, and ontology term mapping has to be somehow integrated. I think, you know, it has to that various people, you know, can in a way be, because you have this overlap, right, of different in different groups try to develop, like, you know, somewhat overlapping ontologies with probably different use cases, or you know, maybe some more reference, some more application driven, but would definitely help if you have a request system, you know, which is this OntoloBridge, this ambition of OntoloBridge. And then if that would be possible to give people access to that, the different stakeholders, regardless maybe of if they are the ontology owners or not, and then combine that somehow with mapping, right, or something like that. Yeah,
we need tools. I think we need tools to be able to make it easier for people, because the proliferation of ontologies means we're having more standardized data, and I think that's great. We just have to make it the work effort a little bit easier, I think, for people.
And then, you know, just very briefly, you know, like I'm really like think about this a lot. You know, the two extremes in a way, right? If there was a perfect world having like, you know, only one ontology per domain, and I think that's of course definitely challenging, right? Because there is probably not only one way to describe the world, right, or even describe a domain. And then on the other hand, you know, everybody does their own thing. You try to kind of resolve it or clean it up via mapping, right? Which is also very challenging because of, you know, we already heard the various reasons, right? I mean, you don't even necessarily have semantic consistency, right, between everything, particularly if you map 3 things together, right? So what do you think? Like, is there like a golden middle ground or something like that?
I think we have to be grounded in reality. People are going to develop resources. They need them for particular purposes. We have to find a way to connect each other. And then also provide support. I think that's what a lot of the OBO Foundry wants to do, is provide that support for that development. And I think we need some new tools so we can do it, make it easier for people to develop the terms.